I think we've all had statements about the irreconcilable differences between STEM and HAS disciplines repeated to us ad nauseum. As someone who has a background in both, a large part of my research and teaching has focused on forging connections between the sciences and the arts and collaborating across disciplinary and generic divides. Over the last few years, as Anna mentioned, I've engaged in setting up medical humanities research networks in the UK and that now also here at UQ. And my work has looked at transgender histories and transgender narratives in and outside of medical contexts. And I have worked extensively on the history of reproductive medicine and trans and intersex phenomena. I'm currently working on two projects. One on the history of early modern reproductive medicine and one in collaboration with various activists and medical professionals in Sweden. And what we're working on is primarily to contextualize contemporary intersex and transgender experience. And this latter part of my work is what I'm going to talk about primarily today. Let's see, is this there? Yes. So narratives of gender dysphoria and physical difference are very important to transgender medicine and the transgender activist movement. As the trans theorist and historian Susan Stryker puts it, our stories and histories are what makes us what we are. When transgender became widely recognized and popularized in the second half of the 20th century, a large body of transgender narratives were published and circulated. And these were avidly read and discussed within the transgender communities. And as the trans activist Sandy Stone puts it, they literally became the making of transgender people. She refers to them as the OTF, the obligatory transsexual file. The transgender theorist Bernice Hausman explains that this was part of the clinical experience and the journey towards transition. Collecting the autobiographies of successful transsexuals constitutes an important part of transsexual self-construction and self-education and self-preparation for encounters with clinical personnel, primarily because their success in obtaining the medical treatments they seek depends upon the ability to convince doctors that their personal history matches the official sanctioned etiology. So most theorists agree that transgender people are exceptionally well read. Each generation of transgender people in the late 20th century carefully read and examined their personal experience in relation to the generation coming before them. And there were numerous academic as well as more popular works within the history of medicine, gender, and sexuality, creating a place for transgender experience throughout Western and non-Western contexts. In my research, I approach these narratives as a form of self-creation and identification through narrative. They are used as experiential precedents, laying the groundwork for an understanding of your own experience and providing a role model for the construction of an identifiable transgender identity. Up until the 1990s, transgender narratives of self primarily took the form of published autobiographies, and you see some of the most famous ones up here. And they were carefully compiled and edited over several years of transition, whereas more recently, very interestingly, transgender people tend to use online platforms. And in the early 2000s, we primarily saw a range of transgender transition blogs, and these are often still running, but we now also have a lot of Instagram and vlogs, especially among the younger generation of transgender people. So now transgender theorists often approach these narratives of self as quite problematic. They see them in light of the medical profession as something that leads to further dysphoria, self-delusion, and potential breakdowns. They also argue that the medical profession's pathologization and encouragement of false narratives only service the bureaucratic standardization of transgender phenomena, and that future treatments should focus on harnessing and cultivating the true selves and genuine experiences of transgender people. And this has formed a rather negative academic basis among transgender theorists, towards the medical profession. I find this quite problematic, though, mainly because narratives are part of all people's construction of self. And I think academic transgender theorists have dismissed them a bit too easily. I also think it's unhelpful to refer to true and false narratives, as all narratives are to some extent constructed, and it's not necessarily the truth of them that makes them useful and viable. Those of us in the room who are historians or who work in literary studies will know that there's no such thing as an entirely objective and true history. And our perspective on the past will always reflect some form of present intentionality. It's also unhelpful to discard the narratives constructed in conversation with the medical profession. As long as patient histories are treated as heterogeneous and changeable, they can be very useful therapeutic tools. Rita Sharon, who many consider to be the founder of North American medical humanities, argues that the application of certain narrative techniques and the transition of narratives of illness and unhappiness towards narratives of treatment and health are the basis of any productive clinical encounter. My current collaborations with the activist group Full Personality Expression Sweden, or FPE Sweden as they call themselves, and the pediatric intersex unit at the Karolinska Hospital in Stockholm focuses on delineation and careful consideration of personal narratives and the multifarious and generational nature of different types of narratives of self. This particularly becomes the case in transgender, where the different identity categories you use for yourself change across the generations. In my work with FPE, I found that different generations of trans people do rely on different sets of narratives and form different types of relations with medical professionals, with an older generation being much more receptive to working productively with medicine. And I think partly because of these narratives of hostility that are coming out of transgender studies today, the kind of idea that the medical profession is opposed to the actual political needs and identities of transgender people. In both of my collaborative studies, I found that the Swedish medical professionals have been very open to rethinking their approach to trans and intersex conditions. I've also found that there is more hostility towards different forms of transgender and intersex theory and theorists in the transgender and intersex communities than there is towards the medical profession. And this is primarily coming out of experiences of feeling ostracized and excluded when your experience doesn't exactly match the theoretical frameworks. There's also an amount of pressure to make your experiences match the theory, with some trans and intersex people being made to feel that they're behind the times or not progressive enough if they don't conform with a general nonconformism. All in all, I found that the most productive outcome of my collaborative work has been to open up conversations between humanities perspectives, medical practice, and trans and intersex communities. And the conversations we've had have been really, really productive. There has been too much sectarianism in these groups and hostility, which has caused us to disregard the important lessons we may learn from each other. And my work focuses on bringing humanities and community perspectives into the clinical practices and building a productive practice out of this.